"I'm your wife," she said, and set a plate of food in front of him. "Can I taste it first to show you it's safe?" Eli Mercer stared at the woman standing in his kitchen. His hands went still. His chest locked up like a fist closing around nothing. 15 years of silence. 15 years of eating alone in the dark. And now this stranger was offering to taste his food like he was a man who needed protecting. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just looked at her and felt something inside him crack open for the first time since Sarah died. If this story already has you feeling something, subscribe to our channel, follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Eli Mercer woke at 4 in the morning because that was the only time of day that didn't require anything from him. He didn't need an alarm. His body had learned long ago that sleep was just something you endured until the sky went gray enough to go back to work. He pulled on his boots in the dark, the leather stiff from the cold, and he didn't light a lamp because he knew every inch of that house by feel and by memory. And he preferred it that way. Light made things visible that he didn't want to see. The ranch was 40 acres of Wyoming cold. Red Rock Valley in early November was a thing that got into your bones and stayed there, and Eli had stopped minding years ago. Cold was simple. Cold didn't ask questions. He fed the horses first. He always fed the horses first. "Easy," he told the gray mare whose name was Pearl, and she nosed against his palm, looking for sugar he didn't have. "You know I don't carry anything sweet." Pearl snorted. Eli almost smiled. Almost. By the time the sun came up, he had already repaired the north fence line, hauled water from the creek, and stacked 2 cords of wood against the barn wall. His foreman, old Decker Hayes, showed up around 7, with 2 ranch hands and a look on his face like he had news he didn't want to deliver. "Morning," Decker said. "Morning," Eli said, and went back to splitting wood. "Stage came through Ridgeline last night," Decker said. "Word is, there's a woman asking about your property." Eli's axe came down. The wood split clean. "What kind of woman?" "Young, traveling alone. Got papers, they say." "Papers for what?" Decker cleared his throat. "Marriage contract." The axe stopped mid-lift. Eli turned and looked at his foreman for a long moment without speaking. Decker had worked for him for 9 years. He knew better than to make jokes about certain things, and the look on his face right now was not the look of a man making a joke. "That's not possible," Eli said. "I'm just telling you what they told me. I haven't written to any agency. I haven't signed anything. I haven't spoken to anyone about—" "Eli." Decker's voice was quiet. "The stage comes through at noon." Eli didn't go to meet it. He told himself he didn't need to. Some clerical error, some confusion of names or addresses. Wyoming Territory had more than one Mercer, and Red Rock Valley had more than one ranch. And whatever this was, it would sort itself out without him standing in the road looking foolish. He went back to the north pasture and spent an hour checking the cattle, moving slow and deliberate, the way he always did, counting heads looking for lameness, checking the water trough. He was good at this. He was good at work that had clear, finite requirements. You counted the cattle. The cattle were either there or they weren't. You fixed what was broken. You moved on. He heard the stagecoach come through at noon. He kept his head down. He heard it stop. He kept working. He heard footsteps on the road, light ones, a woman's pace, and then they stopped. And then there was a voice that carried across the open ground with a clarity that the Wyoming wind didn't usually allow. "Excuse me, is this the Mercer Ranch?" One of his hands, young Tommy Briggs, said yes. "Can you tell Mr. Mercer his wife is here?" Eli straightened up slowly. He turned around. She was standing at the fence line, one hand resting on the post, the other holding a leather bag that had seen better years. She was wearing a dark blue traveling coat that was too thin for this weather, and her hair was pulled back in a way that had mostly survived the journey, and she was looking directly at him, with eyes that were calm in a way he hadn't expected. He walked toward her because there was nothing else to do. Up close, she was younger than he'd expected. 25 maybe. Clear-eyed. Not frightened, which surprised him. Women who arrived unannounced at isolated ranches usually had the good sense to look at least a little frightened. "I think," he said, "there has been a mistake." "There has," she agreed. "But I'm not sure it was mine." Her name was Clara Whitfield. She had come from Cheyenne on a stage that took 14 hours and stopped 4 times in weather that had no business calling itself November. She had a document signed by someone named Jonah Pike of the Western Matrimonial Bureau, which stated that she had been matched with one Eli Caden Mercer of Red Rock Valley, Wyoming, and that the arrangement had been consented to by both parties. Eli looked at the document for a long time. "I did not sign this," he said. "Your name is on it." "I know what my name looks like. I did not sign this." Clara looked at the signature. She looked at him. "I believe you," she said. He wasn't expecting that. "You believe me. You don't look like a man who sends for brides," she said, not unkindly. "You look like a man who's been alone so long he's forgotten there was ever another option." Eli handed the paper back to her. His jaw was tight. "You need to get back on that stage." "The stage is already gone." He looked up. The road was empty. "It continues on to Laramie," Clara said. "Next one comes back through in 4 days." 4 days. He stood there in the cold and thought about 4 days, and about the way his ranch house had 17 rooms, and he used 3 of them, and about how the nearest town was 8 miles east, and this woman's coat was not going to survive a Wyoming night. "There's a room," he said finally. "You can stay until the stage comes back." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. This is temporary." "Of course," she said, and she picked up her bag and looked at him with those calm eyes and said, "Could you show me where the kitchen is? I'd like to cook something hot before my hands stop working entirely." She cooked. That was the first thing that broke something loose in him. Not in an emotional way, not yet, but in the way of a man who has been living in a house that smells like dust and leather and wood smoke for 15 years. Suddenly walking into a kitchen that smelled like something else entirely. She made a simple beef stew with the dried provisions she found in his pantry and the last of the root vegetables from the cold cellar, and she did it without asking permission and without making a production of it. And when she set the bowl in front of him at the kitchen table, she sat down across from him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Eli looked at the bowl. He looked at her. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm doing it anyway. I can feed myself." "Can you?" She glanced at the pantry. "Because from what I saw in there, you've been living on hardtack and canned beans for what looks like several months." He had no answer for that. "Eat," she said, "before it gets cold." He ate. And the food was good, genuinely good, the kind of good that made him realize uncomfortably that he had not tasted a meal like this in a very long time. He didn't say so, but he finished every bite. She didn't try to talk to him much that first evening, which was the second thing that threw him off. Every person Eli had dealt with in the past 15 years, ranch hands, merchants in town, the occasional county official, fell into one of 2 categories. There were people who were uncomfortable with his silence and filled it with chatter that required nothing from him. And there were people who were uncomfortable with his silence and kept trying to dig something out of him. Some explanation for why a man with a working ranch and no visible enemies chose to live like a hermit. Clara did neither. She washed the dishes after supper. She found where he kept the extra blankets and made up the spare room at the end of the hall without asking him to show her. She came back to the kitchen once to ask if the well water was safe to drink, and when he said yes, she filled a pitcher, said goodnight, and went to bed. That was it. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she was gone, listening to the quiet settle back around him. Except it didn't settle quite the same way it usually did. There was a weight missing from it, or maybe a weight added. He couldn't tell which. He blew out the lamp and went to his own room and lay on his back in the dark, and stared at the ceiling the way he had every night for 15 years and tried not to think about Sarah. He thought about Sarah anyway. She had died in February. The fever came on fast, 3 days from the first cough to the last breath, and Eli had held her hand through all of it. And at the end, she had squeezed his fingers and tried to say something, and he had leaned in close to hear her. And what came out was just his name. Just Eli. And then she was gone. He was 20 years old. He had buried her on the South Ridge where she always said the light was best in the afternoons, and he had stood there in the February cold without a coat because he forgot to put one on, and he had thought, I will never let anyone close enough to do this to me again. He had kept that promise to himself with remarkable consistency for 15 years. The next morning, Clara was up before him. That had never happened. Not once in 15 years had Eli Mercer woken to find someone else already in his kitchen. He stopped in the doorway, disoriented, and watched her pour coffee into a cup she had apparently found by herself, and place it on the table at what had already become, without his permission, his spot. "Good morning," she said. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. "How did you know where I kept the coffee?" I looked. He sat down. He picked up the cup. It was exactly the right strength, which bothered him more than it should have. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "Go ahead," she said, sitting down across from him with her own cup. "I don't need company. I don't need conversation. I don't need—" He stopped. "I don't need anything from you." She considered this. "All right. I'm not trying to be unkind." "You're not being unkind," she said. "You're being honest. I appreciate honesty." She looked at him over her cup. "Can I be honest with you in return?" He gestured for her to go ahead. "I have nowhere else to go," she said. "My father passed in the spring. My brother took everything. I had $17 and a letter from a matrimonial agency that turned out to be fraudulent, and I used 14 of those dollars to get here because at least here there was supposed to be a contract and a roof and a reason." She set down her cup. "I'm not asking you to be my husband. I understand that the contract is fraudulent and you owe me nothing. But the stage doesn't come back for 3 days, and I would like to spend those 3 days being useful rather than being a burden, and when the stage comes back I will leave on it. You have my word." Eli looked at her for a long moment. "That's a lot of words before 7 in the morning," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "You're right. I'll stop." "No." He surprised himself. "It's no. Go ahead." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "You can stay the 3 days." She didn't just stay in the house. He had expected her to stay in the house. Women who came from Cheyenne on a matrimonial contract weren't generally in the habit of following ranchers out to the barn at 6 in the morning to observe the morning feeding routine. But on the second day, he came out to find her already there, leaning on the stall gate, watching Pearl with an expression of quiet appreciation. "She's beautiful," Clara said. "She's stubborn," Eli said, moving past her to get the feed. "The best ones usually are." Clara glanced at him sideways. "Can I help? You don't know anything about horses." "I know a fair amount about horses, actually. My father kept 3. He handed her a scoop of feed without comment. She took it without ceremony and leaned over the gate and let Pearl take it from her palm, flat-handed and confident, which was the correct way to do it, and which most people who claimed to know horses still got wrong. He watched her. He looked away. "You're not what I expected," he said before he could stop himself. She didn't ask what he'd expected. She just said, "What gave it away?" Most people are afraid of horses that size. "I told you, I know horses." She handed the empty scoop back to him. "What about you? What about me? Are you afraid of anything?" He was quiet for long enough that she must have realized she'd gone somewhere she wasn't supposed to go because she said, "Sorry, that's too personal." "Yes," he said. "Not yes. It's too personal. Just yes." She nodded, and she didn't push, and that was the third thing about her that he couldn't quite categorize. Here. Decker found him by the creek that afternoon, with a look on his face that Eli had come to associate with trouble. "The woman," Decker said. "What about her?" "Tommy was in Ridgeline this morning picking up wire. Says there's talk." Decker scratched the back of his neck. "Word got around that a woman came in on the stage with papers claiming this as her destination. Some folks are saying you brought her out here on a fake contract." Eli stopped walking. "That's backwards." "I know it is. She was sent here by someone using a forged document." "I know that too. But Eli," Decker lowered his voice, "Deputy Brennan's been asking questions. Something about property transfer irregularities. I don't know the details, but his name came up in connection with the bureau that issued the contract." "Who is Jonah Pike?" Decker's expression shifted, just slightly, but Eli caught it. "You know him," Eli said. "I've heard the name. He runs contracts out of Cheyenne, matrimonial property land agreements. Word is he's been known to forge signatures and collect fees from both ends of a deal. What does he gain from this?" Decker was quiet for a beat. "Your ranch is 40 acres of prime valley land, Eli. If a marriage contract exists, even a fraudulent one, and the woman has no family to claim her back, and you have no legal representation to contest it." "He's trying to use her as a lever," Eli said slowly. "That's my guess." The cold settled harder around him. He stood there by the creek and thought about Clara sitting across from him that morning with her hands around a coffee cup and her $17 and her nowhere else to go, and something in his chest that had been locked down for 15 years shifted without warning. "Does she know?" he asked. Hard to say. If Pike sold her the contract in good faith. He didn't sell her anything in good faith. Nothing about this is good faith. He turned and walked back toward the house. "Eli!" Decker called after him. "What are you going to do?" Eli didn't answer. He didn't know yet. She was in the kitchen again when he came in, her back to him, stirring something on the stove that smelled like cinnamon and dried apples, and for a split second, just one, the shape of her in his kitchen against the afternoon light was so domestic and so present that he forgot where he was. Then he remembered. "Clara." She turned. She read something in his face immediately. "What happened?" "Sit down." She sat. He sat across from her and told her everything Decker had told him. Pike's name, the forged contracts, the property angle, Brennan's investigation. He laid it out plain and without editorializing, because that was the only way he knew how to deliver bad news, and he watched her face while he talked. She didn't crumble. He'd expected her to crumble, or at least flinch. She sat perfectly still, her hands flat on the table, and she listened all the way to the end. "He told me the contract was legitimate," she said when he finished. "He told me the rancher had specifically requested a capable woman with experience in rural life. He said the man had been vetted and was well regarded." Her jaw was tight. "He charged me $6 for the arrangement." $6. Out of her 17. "He robbed you," Eli said. "Yes." She looked down at her hands. "He did. And he may be trying to use your presence here to make a legal claim against my property." "I understand." She looked up. "I'll leave tomorrow. I won't wait for the stage. I'll walk to Ridgeline if I have to. The farther I am from here, the less leverage he has." "It's 8 miles in November." "I know how far it is." "And it won't actually help," he said. "The document already exists. You leaving doesn't make it disappear." She stared at him. "Then what do we do?" He hadn't said "we" in a very long time. The word felt strange in his mouth, like something he'd picked up from the ground without meaning to. "I don't know yet," he said. "But you're not walking 8 miles in November." She held his gaze for a moment. "Why do you care?" she asked, and her voice was genuinely curious, not accusing. "You've been trying to get rid of me since I arrived." He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. "Because it's the right thing," he said, and then quieter. "And because you haven't done anything wrong." The kitchen was very quiet. "Neither have you," she said. He didn't respond to that. He stood up and pushed his chair back and went to the window and looked out at the gray sky and the bare ridgeline and the smoke rising from the bunkhouse, and he stood there until the pressure in his chest had reduced itself to something manageable. "Supper's almost ready," she said from behind him. Her voice was gentle. "You should eat." He didn't turn around. "All right." "And Eli." He heard her stand. He heard her move to the stove. "Whatever this is, whatever Pike thinks he's doing, I want you to know something." "What?" "I'm not part of it. Whatever he told me, whatever he planned, I'm not his instrument. I won't be used against you." He finally turned. She was looking at him over her shoulder from the stove, one hand on the ladle, and her expression was very steady and very clear. "I know," he said, and he meant it. That was the moment something in Red Rock Valley shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but the way a door shifts when the latch finally releases, barely audible, and yet suddenly entirely open. He didn't sleep that night. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the wind come down off the ridge the way it always did in November, hard and without apology. And he thought about Jonah Pike and forged contracts, and a woman asleep at the end of his hallway who had nowhere else to go and $6 fewer than she started with. He thought about the way she'd said, "I'm not his instrument." He thought about the way he'd believed her immediately without question, which was not the way Eli Mercer operated. Eli Mercer did not believe people immediately. Eli Mercer had learned a long time ago that trust was something you built slowly, the way you built anything worth keeping, brick by brick with mortar that needed time to set. You didn't hand it over in a kitchen over a bowl of beef stew. And yet, he sat up at 3 a.m. and pulled on his boots and went to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark with his hands around a cold cup of coffee he hadn't bothered to heat, and he stayed there until the gray light started coming through the window and he heard her door open at the end of the hall. She appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped when she saw him. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I slept." She looked at him with an expression that said she didn't believe that for a second, but she didn't argue. She moved to the stove and stirred the coals back to life and put water on to boil, and she did all of it quietly and efficiently in the way of someone who had been taking care of a household for years and knew how to do it without making a production. "I've been thinking," she set her back to him. "So have I. I want to go to Ridgeline, not to leave, not yet. To talk to someone who knows the law." She paused. "Is there anyone there?" "Deputy Brennan. The one who's already asking questions about you." "Yes." She turned and looked at him. "Is he honest?" Eli thought about Hal Brennan. 40-something heavyset had been deputy in Ridgeline since before Eli bought the ranch. He had once returned a horse that wasn't his, and once arrested a man who was his own cousin. "Mostly," Eli said. "Then I want to talk to him. If Pike is using me as part of a scheme, Brennan needs to know that I'm a willing witness against it." She crossed her arms. "He can't use me as leverage if I'm already on the other side of the room." Eli looked at her. "That's a good thought. Don't sound surprised." He almost said, "I'm not." He stopped himself. "I'll take you to Ridgeline this morning." "You don't have to. 8 miles is too far to walk. And if Brennan sees you arrive alone, he'll make up his own story before you open your mouth." He stood up. "I'll hitch the wagon at 7. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Eli." It was the first time she had used his name. He picked up his cup and went to dump it in the basin and tried to identify what had just happened in his chest when she said it. He couldn't name it. He filed it away under things he would not examine and went to the barn. The ride to Ridgeline took an hour and a half over frozen road, and they covered most of it in silence, which Eli had expected. What he hadn't expected was that the silence would be comfortable. Not the loaded silence of two strangers avoiding confrontation, the ordinary silence of two people who have already said the necessary things and don't need to fill the air with noise to prove they're present. Clara sat beside him on the wagon bench with her thin coat buttoned to the throat and her hands in her lap. and she watched the country go by without complaint. Twice, she pointed out things: a hawk riding a thermal above the ridge, a cluster of pronghorn moving fast across the flats, not demanding comment, just sharing what she saw. He looked each time. He said nothing, but he looked. They hit the edge of ridgeline around 8:30. It was a town of 200 people and one main street, and the particular Wyoming combination of hard practicality and thin hospitality that Eli had long since stopped expecting anything from. He was aware as he drove down the main street of people looking, not staring, just looking. The way people in a small town look when something slightly out of the ordinary comes through. Eli Mercer driving in on a Tuesday was unusual enough. Eli Mercer driving in with a woman beside him was something that would be discussed over supper tables for a week. "They're looking," Clara said, not moving her eyes from the road ahead. "Yes." "Does that bother you?" "No." A pause. "Does it bother you?" "I'm used to people looking at me like I'm something that needs explaining," she said. And her voice was flat when she said it, not bitter, just honest. The voice of someone reporting a fact rather than lodging a complaint. Eli looked at her profile for a moment. Then he looked back at the road and drove. Deputy Hal Brennan's office was at the east end of the main street, and he was in it, which was the first piece of luck Eli had encountered in several days. He was a broad man, with a gray mustache, that he had apparently never made peace with, because he was always pushing it out of the way with his thumb when he talked, as though it kept arriving somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. He looked up when they came in. His eyes went from Eli to Clara and back to Eli in a way that was professional and careful and not unkind. "Mercer," he said. "Brennan." Eli pulled his hat off. "This is Clara Whitfield. She's the woman who came in on Friday's stage." "I heard." Brennan stood. "Miss Whitfield, sit down, please." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Clara sat. Eli stood by the door. "I've been meaning to get out to the ranch to speak with you. We thought it made more sense to come to you," Clara said. "Smart." Brennan settled back into his chair and looked at her steadily. "Tell me about Jonah Pike." She told him everything. She was precise and linear about it. Dates, amounts. The specific language Pike had used to describe the arrangement, the document he had given her, the fee he had charged. She had the document in her coat pocket, and she placed it on the desk in front of Brennan without being asked. Eli watched Brennan read it. The deputy's expression didn't change, but something around his eyes shifted. "He charged you $6, Brennan said. "Yes, and you were told the rancher had consented and signed." "I was told the contract was complete and verified." Brennan looked at Eli. "You've never had any contact with the Western Matrimonial Bureau." "I've never heard of it before Friday," Eli said. Brennan pushed his mustache out of the way with his thumb. "That signature on the document. I'm going to need you to write your actual signature for me to compare." Eli crossed to the desk and picked up the pen Brennan held out and signed the paper Brennan slid toward him. Brennan held the two signatures side by side and looked at them for a long moment. "It's a decent forgery," he said. "Not professional, but decent." He set both papers down. "Pike has done this before. Different counties, different names. He identifies ranches with clear title and no immediate family ties, no wife, no children, and he creates a contract that puts a woman on the property. Then he shows up with a secondary document claiming a financial interest in the property transfer." He looked at Eli. "You would have gotten a visit from him within the month." "On what grounds?" Eli asked. "He would have claimed to be acting as agent for the woman in the marriage arrangement and entitled to a placement fee secured against the property." Brennan leaned back. "It sounds ridiculous. Most judges throw it out immediately. But the process costs time and legal fees, and some ranchers, particularly ones who live alone and don't have a lawyer on call, find it easier to pay him off than fight it." The room was quiet for a moment. "He targeted you specifically," Clara said to Eli. Her voice was controlled, but her hands had tightened in her lap. "He chose me because I had no family to involve, and he put us both in an impossible position on purpose." That's exactly right, Brennan said. He looked at Clara with something that had shifted from professional caution into something closer to respect. Miss Whitfield, your willingness to come forward and testify to the details of your arrangement with Pike is significant. I won't pretend I have him in custody, I don't. He's not a man who stays in one county long enough to be caught easily. But your statement gives us grounds to file with the territorial court, and that creates a legal record that makes his claim against Mercer's property essentially unenforceable. Clara let out a slow breath. Then I'll give you whatever statement you need. I'll have my clerk write it up. Brennan stood. He looked at Eli. You should get a lawyer, Mercer. I know you don't like town, and I know you don't like people, and I know you particularly don't like spending money on things that feel like they shouldn't be necessary. But get a lawyer. I'll get a lawyer, Eli said. Brennan almost smiled. That might be the most cooperative thing you've said to me in 9 years. They were back on the wagon by noon. The statement had taken 2 hours. Brennan's clerk was thorough, which was either admirable or aggravating, depending on how much you valued your time, and Eli valued his time considerably. But it was done, and the document was signed and witnessed and filed, and the weight of the past 4 days had shifted into something that felt, if not resolved, at least contained. Clara was quiet on the ride back. A different kind of quiet than the morning, not comfortable this time, but internal, turned inward. He let it sit for a while. Then he said, "What are you thinking?" She glanced at him. "I'm thinking that I'm angry," she said. At Pike, at myself. She looked back at the road. I should have known. I should have asked more questions, looked more carefully at the document, demanded references. I was desperate, and I let that make me careless, and now I've caused you a legal problem you shouldn't have to deal with. You didn't cause it. Pike caused it. I was the mechanism. You were the target, he said. Same as me, different angle, same scheme. He kept his eyes on the horses. Stop taking credit for what he did. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You're unexpectedly direct." Is that a complaint? No. He heard something change in her voice, not quite a smile, but close. I appreciate it, actually. Most people aren't direct with women. They talk around things. That seems like a waste of everyone's time. It is, she agreed. And then, after another pause, Eli, what happens now? With me, I mean, not legally. I understand the legal piece, but practically. She turned to look at him. The stage comes back tomorrow. He had been thinking about that since they left Ridgeline. He had been thinking about it in Brennan's office while the clerk wrote up the statement. He had been thinking about it, if he was honest with himself, since 3 a.m. when he sat at the kitchen table in the dark. Where would you go? He asked. Cheyenne, I suppose. Try to find work. What kind of work? Whatever's available. I can cook. I can sew. I know horses. I kept my father's books for 3 years before he died, so I can do figures. She said it matter-of-factly, not fishing for sympathy. Just laying out inventory. The ranch needs a bookkeeper, Eli said. He didn't look at her. The silence stretched. Eli, Decker is a good foreman. He keeps the operation running, but the books have been a mess since for several years. I'm not... He stopped. Numbers aren't what I'm good at. Are you offering me a job? She asked slowly. I'm saying the position exists if someone wanted it. That's a very careful way of saying yes. He said nothing. You don't have to do this, she said. You've already done more than anyone was obligated to do. You don't owe me work on top of shelter and a ride to the deputy's office. It's not about obligation. He finally looked at her. You're good at things the ranch needs. It's a practical arrangement. She held his gaze for a moment, searching his face for something. He didn't know what she found there. All right, she said finally. I'll stay, but I want to be paid fairly, not charity wages. Fair wages, he agreed. And I want it clear that I'm an employee, not the other thing. Understood. She nodded once. Then we have an arrangement." He looked back at the road. Something in his chest was doing something he didn't have language for, and he decided firmly not to investigate it. The next 3 days moved differently than the ones before. Before there had been the tension of impermanence, the knowledge that she would leave when the stage came. The careful way they'd both moved around the temporary nature of things. Now that was gone, replaced by something more settled, and therefore strangely more nerve-wracking. She took over the books the second morning after their return from Ridgeline. He showed her where he kept them, 3 ledgers going back 6 years, 2 of which were technically his responsibility, and 1 of which had been started by Decker and abandoned in frustration. And she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and started from the beginning quietly and didn't ask him questions. He tried to go about his usual work. He found himself checking on her twice before noon. Not because he needed to. He told himself it was because he wanted to make sure she had everything she needed. He was not convincing. The third time he appeared in the kitchen doorway, she looked up without looking up, somehow aware of him, without raising her eyes from the page, and said, "I'm fine, Eli." "I know," he said. "You don't need to check on me." "I'm not checking on you." She looked up then, one eyebrow slightly raised. "I was walking past," he said. "The kitchen is not on the way to anywhere from the barn." He had nothing to say to that. He left. He heard her laugh, quiet, genuine, as he walked away down the hall, and he stopped in the corridor for just a moment because it was the first time he had heard a woman laugh in this house since Sarah, and the sound did something to him that he was entirely unprepared for. Not grief, exactly. Something more complicated. Something that grief had been covering over for 15 years that was now unexpectedly beginning to surface. He went back to the barn and threw himself into work and didn't stop until his arms ached. Decker noticed. Of course Decker noticed. He came to Eli late in the afternoon of the 4th day, while Eli was replacing a cracked section of fencing along the south pasture, and he leaned on the post and watched him work for a while, in the way that meant he was organizing words. "She's good," Decker said finally. "She knows her way around a ledger. Found 3 billing errors I'd been carrying forward for 2 years, quietly. Didn't make a production of it." Decker paused. "Didn't make me feel stupid about it either. Just fixed them and told me so I knew." Eli kept working. "She's been talking to the horses," Decker added. "Pearl likes her." "Pearl doesn't like anybody." "I know." Decker was quiet for a moment. "Tommy Briggs asked her at breakfast this morning if she was planning to stay permanent. She said that was between her and you." He paused. "Tommy said she seemed like she fit." Eli set down his hammer. He straightened up and looked at the pasture and at the ridge and at the thin winter sky above it. "She's a bookkeeper," he said. "She's an employee." Eli. "That's what she is, Decker." Decker pushed himself off the post and picked up his own hammer. "All right," he said, in the voice of a man who does not believe a word he has just agreed to. "She's the bookkeeper." The first time he almost touched her was an accident. She was carrying a full pot of water from the stove to the wash basin, and she miscalculated the edge of the table and stumbled, and he was closer than he realized, and his hand came up and caught her elbow before the pot went over. She caught herself. The water sloshed but didn't spill. She said, "Oh," and then she turned and found him 6 inches away, and they both went still at the same moment. His hand was on her arm. Just her elbow through the sleeve of her dress. Through fabric. It was the barest possible contact. He let go. Fast. Too fast. She looked at him. Not startled, she had already recovered from the stumble. She was looking at the way he had pulled back, and her expression was careful and thoughtful. "Thank you," she said. "You should be more careful," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I know." She set the pot down slowly. "Eli." "It's fine." "I know it's fine. I just—" She stopped. She seemed to be choosing her words with considerable care. "You don't have to pull away from me like I'm going to break you." He was quiet. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said. Her voice was very quiet. Not soft in a saccharine way, just measured. I know that might not mean much coming from someone you've known for less than a week, but I want you to know it. He looked at her. He looked at the wall. He looked at his own hands. It's not about hurt, he said, and then stopped because that was more than he'd intended to say. She didn't push. She never pushed. She just waited the way she always waited, patient and still, like someone who has learned that the most important things arrive in their own time. He left the kitchen without explaining further, but he didn't sleep again that night. On the 6th day it rained. Not snow yet that would come in another week, but hard Wyoming rain that turned the road to mud and kept everyone inside, and the ranch house contracted around its 4 inhabitants with the particular intimacy of bad weather and shared walls. Decker and the Hands had their bunkhouse. Eli and Clara had the main house. He found himself in the sitting room for the first time in years. He didn't go in there as a rule. It had been Sarah's room, in the sense that she had been the one who wanted it. She had arranged the chairs and picked the curtains and put the small braided rug in front of the fireplace, and after she died, he had simply closed the door and left everything exactly as it was, because changing it felt like erasure, and not changing it felt like drowning, and the easiest solution was to never go in. He went in because it was raining, and the kitchen was where she was working, and he needed to be somewhere else for a while. He was sitting in the chair by the window, watching the rain, when she knocked at the open door. "I didn't know you used this room," she said. "I don't usually." She hesitated. "Should I leave?" "No." The word came out before he thought about it. He looked at the fire. "No, it's fine." She came in and sat in the other chair, the one that had been Sarah's, though she didn't know that, and she had her own cup of tea and a ledger she'd been working on, and she set the ledger on her knee and went back to it without making any demands on him. The rain came down. The fire burned. The clock on the mantel that had been Sarah's moved through the afternoon. He didn't know when he started talking. There was no clear beginning. The words came out slowly, at first the way things do when they've been shut up too long and the door finally opens just a crack. "My wife liked this room," he said. Clara looked up. She said nothing. "She died 15 years ago." He kept his eyes on the fire. Fever. It was fast. A pause. "People say that like it's a comfort. Like fast is better. It wasn't better. Fast just meant I didn't have time to—" He stopped. "I didn't have time." Clara set down the ledger. She didn't speak. She didn't try to fill the silence with condolences. She just looked at him and waited. "I closed the house down after," he said. "Not literally. I kept the ranch running. But everything else I just stopped. Stopped going to town unless I had to. Stopped having people out. Stopped—" He turned the cup in his hands. "Just stopped." "For 15 years, Clara said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Were you happy before?" The question surprised him. Not, "I'm sorry," or "that must have been hard," the questions people usually reached for. She went straight past sympathy to something more specific. "Yes," he said. And the word came out with a weight that surprised him too, because he hadn't said it out loud in 15 years, and he'd forgotten it was still true. "Then you know how," she said. He looked at her. "You know how to be happy," she said simply. "You haven't forgotten. You just stopped doing it." She held his gaze. "That's different from not knowing." He stared at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his face, something he worked to control and almost did. "You're very certain about things," he said. "Not usually," she said, "but sometimes." The rain came down harder against the window. The fire shifted. Eli looked at the chair she was sitting in, the chair that had been Sarah's, and waited for the grief that always came with that image, the tight, cold clench of it. It came, but it was quieter than it used to be, like something heard through a closed door instead of right up against his ear. He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't know what to do with any of this. But he sat in the sitting room for the rest of the afternoon, and the rain came down outside, and the woman in the chair across from him went back to her ledger, and neither of them spoke much, and it was something he didn't have a word for. Not comfort exactly. Not happiness. Something earlier than those. Something that came before. He filed it away under things he would not examine, same as always. But this time, the file didn't quite close. That night, after she had gone to her room and he had checked the horses and locked the barn and come back to the dark house, he stood in the hallway for a long moment outside the door of the sitting room. He thought about what she had said. You know how to be happy. You just stopped doing it. He thought about 15 years of cold mornings and silent kitchens, and a house with 17 rooms and 3 of them used. He thought about the way she had sat in Sarah's chair and not known it, and the way the grief had come quietly, instead of the way it usually did, crashing and total like a wave that knocked you under. He thought about the moment his hand caught her arm by the stove, and the way he'd pulled back, and the look on her face when he did. You don't have to pull away from me like I'm going to break you. He stood in the dark hallway for a long time. Then he went to his room and lay down, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, fell asleep before the clock struck midnight. It wasn't much. It wasn't anything anyone else would have noticed. But for Eli Mercer, it was the first thing that had changed in 15 years. And somewhere in the part of him that had been asleep the longest, something recognized that fact and held very, very still, the way you hold still when something wild and wary is finally close enough to touch. He was better at mornings now. That was the first thing he noticed, not dramatically, not in a way he could point to and explain, but in the small mechanical way that change usually arrives. He woke at 4 the way he always did, but he didn't lie in the dark as long before getting up. He didn't dread the kitchen the way he used to dread it, that hollow square of silence where the absence of another person had always been loudest. Now there was coffee already made half the time, or the smell of it starting, and the sound of someone else moving through the house had stopped feeling like an intrusion and started feeling like something else, something he didn't name. Clara had been on the ranch for 11 days. She had found every billing error in 2 years of ledgers. She had reorganized the cold cellar by category and labeled everything in a handwriting that was small and precise and slightly slanted to the right. She had, without asking, repaired the hinge on the barn door that had been sticking since August, because she had found the tools and figured out the problem and fixed it. And when he came to the barn that morning and pushed the door, and it swung clean and easy, he stood there for a moment, not knowing what to do with the fact that someone had just quietly solved a problem he'd been tolerating for 3 months. He asked her about it at breakfast. The hinge, he said. It was sticking, she said, not looking up from her coffee. I know it was sticking. I've been meaning to fix it. I know. I fixed it. He looked at her. You should have told me you were going to. Would you have let me? A pause. No. That's why I didn't tell you. She looked up. Is it fixed correctly? Yes. Then we're both fine. She went back to her coffee. He sat down. He picked up his fork. He was aware in a way that was becoming familiar and still slightly uncomfortable that the corners of his mouth were doing something. Decker, who had witnessed this exchange from the doorway, very carefully turned around and left before Eli could see him smiling. The thing was, and Eli would have denied this strenuously if anyone had pressed him, the thing was that he had stopped counting the days until the stage came back. He had stopped doing that sometime in the second week, and when he noticed he had stopped, he made no effort to start again. Jonah Pike arrived on a Thursday. Eli was in the far north pasture when Tommy Briggs came riding hard across the frozen ground, and the speed of the horse alone told him something was wrong before the boy opened his mouth. Man at the house, Tommy said, pulling up short. Rode in from the road. Didn't knock, just walked up to the porch like he owned the place. Miss Clara's alone. Eli was already moving. He didn't run. He walked fast and hard, the kind of walk that covers ground without announcing itself, and he came around the side of the house, in time to see a man on the porch, medium height, good coat, the kind of easy smile that had been practiced until it looked natural. He was talking to Clara, through the half-open front door, and he had one hand resting on the porch rail in a proprietary way that Eli did not like. Clara had not opened the door further. She stood in the gap with her hand on the frame and her face completely neutral in the way that Eli had come to understand meant she was working very hard to keep it that way. "Mr. Pike," Eli said. The man turned. The practiced smile widened. "Mr. Mercer, just the man I was hoping to see." "Get off my porch." Pike blinked. The smile held, but something behind it recalibrated. "Now I understand there may have been some confusion about the arrangement." "Get off my porch," Eli said again. Same tone, same pace. "And then get off my property. I have a legal document. You have a forgery." Eli stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He was looking up at Pike, and the angle didn't matter because the look on his face was not the look of a man who was looking up at anything. "Deputy Brennan in Ridgeline has a signed statement from Miss Whitfield detailing every element of the fraud. He has a comparison of your forged signature against my actual one, and he has your name attached to a filing that is currently on its way to the territorial court." He paused. "You're not here to collect anything. You're here because you didn't know we'd already moved." Something shifted in Pike's face. The smile stayed, but it tightened around the edges the way a mask tightens when the face underneath it changes expression. "You've been busy," he said. "Miss Whitfield has been busy," Eli said. "Get off my property." Pike looked at Clara. His eyes moved over her in a way that made Eli's jaw tighten. "You understand what you've done," Pike said to her. "Filing against me doesn't make your situation legal. You arrived here on a fraudulent contract, which means your presence on this property is—" "Her presence on this property is as my employee," Eli said. "Hired legally with fair wages and a written agreement, which Decker Hayes witnessed and signed." He hadn't planned to say that. He'd planned it the day before quietly, after Decker had pointed out the legal gap, and it was done and filed in the ledger, and it was the truth. "You have no claim here. Not to the property, not to the contract, not to Miss Whitfield's situation." He took one step up the porch stairs. "And if you're not off this land in the next 3 minutes, I'm going to ride to Ridgeline myself and tell Brennan you came out here to intimidate a witness." The silence held for 5 full seconds. Pike stepped off the porch. He did it smoothly, like a man who was choosing to leave, rather than being driven out, which was the kind of distinction that mattered to men like him. He walked to his horse and mounted, and looked down at Eli from the saddle. "You think this is over?" Pike said. "I think you should leave," Eli said. Pike left. Eli stood at the bottom of the porch steps and watched until the horse was off the property and down the road and no longer visible. Then he turned around. Clara was standing on the porch with her arms crossed and her face still neutral and her eyes very bright. "The written employment agreement," she said. "Decker witnessed it yesterday. You did that yesterday and didn't tell me. I didn't know if you'd want me to." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to stop. "Thank you," she said, and her voice had gone slightly rough at the edges. "Don't thank me," he said. "It's just practical." "Eli." "It's—" "Thank you," she said again firmly, and went back inside. He stood on the porch for another minute in the cold. His heart was going faster than it should have been for a confrontation that had not involved any physical danger whatsoever. He noted this. He decided not to think about why. "Tit," Decker told him that evening, low and direct, that Pike had been seen talking to 2 men in Ridgeline the previous week, men Decker described as the kind who did work they didn't put their names to. Eli listened. He didn't react visibly. But that night he moved his rifle from the barn to the house, and he started sleeping lighter than usual, which was saying something. He didn't tell Clara. He told himself it was because he didn't want to frighten her. The truer reason, which he recognized but didn't examine, was that he didn't want her to leave. If she understood how serious Pike might become, She might decide the practical thing was to put distance between herself and the situation. And the part of Eli Mercer that had been waking up slowly for the past 11 days was not ready for her to go. That part was still fragile and new and did not have a vote, but it made its position known in the way those things always do, quietly, persistently, and at 3 in the morning. He was a fool. He knew he was a fool. He went on being a fool and kept the rifle by the door. The moment that broke everything open came on a Saturday night, 11 days after her arrival, when a cold front came down from the north and drove the temperature down to something that made the walls of the ranch house creak and pop with the contraction of frozen wood. He had been in the sitting room again. He went there more often now, not every night, but enough that it had stopped feeling like a transgression. He'd even moved one of the books from the shelf to the side table, which was a small thing and a significant one. He heard her come down the hall around 9. She stopped in the doorway the way she always did, checking whether he wanted company or solitude, giving him the choice without making it awkward. He had come to depend on that the way she always left him the door. "Cold tonight," she said. "Worst it's been. The fire in my room isn't drawing right." She said it without complaint, just information. "I'll look at it." "You don't have to. I'll look at it in the morning." He looked at her. "There's enough fire in here. Sit down if you want." She came in and sat in her chair. He had stopped thinking of it as Sarah's chair. He had noticed himself doing this, and had not corrected it, and that was its own quiet thing. She pulled her feet up under her, which was not a formal gesture, and wrapped her hands around the mug she'd brought with her, and for a while they sat in the way they had learned to sit together, present, unhurried, not demanding. The fire burned down. He added a log. She was looking at the flames when she said it. "Can I ask you something personal?" He was quiet for a moment. "You can ask." What was she like, Sarah? He had not spoken Sarah's name aloud to another person in 15 years. He had said it to himself sometimes in the way you say the name of something that is gone, not calling it back, just confirming it was real. But to say it in answer to a question, to say it in a room with another person listening, she was... He stopped. He tried again. She was very certain about things. Like you in some ways. He kept his eyes on the fire. She decided something, and it was decided. No going back, no second guessing. I used to find it... He almost smiled. I used to find it aggravating. And then she was gone, and I would have given anything to be aggravated by her again. The fire cracked. Clara didn't move. "She sounds like someone worth grieving," she said. She was. He turned the cup in his hands. She was 22 years old. We had 3 years. 3 good years. His voice was very steady. He had learned over 15 years to make his voice very steady. I thought that would be enough to sustain me. I thought if I kept her memory... He stopped. I think I confused preserving her with stopping time. Like if nothing changed, she was still somehow... He shook his head. That's not sense. It's sense, Clara said quietly. It's the most human thing I've ever heard. He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was very direct and very gentle at once, and she was not trying to solve anything or wrap it up or make it smaller. She was just there. Receiving it. The way good people receive things that are hard without flinching and without fixing. I haven't talked about her, he said. Not to anyone. Not once in 15 years. I know, she said. I could tell. Is it... He stopped. He didn't know how to finish the question. Is it what? Too much. He looked back at the fire. To hear. No, she said, simply immediately. No, Eli. It's not too much. The fire settled. The wind outside pushed against the walls, and the walls held. He sat with the strange new sensation of having said something true to another person and not been destroyed by it. And then Clara set down her mug, and she said in a voice that was quiet and careful and serious, I'm your wife on paper at least, even if neither of us chose it. And I know that means nothing real. But can I ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly? He looked at her. Go ahead. When I touched your arm when you caught me at the stove, you pulled away so fast. She held his gaze. Was it me? Did I do something that made you? No, he said, fast, then slower. No, it wasn't you. Then what was it? The question hung in the air between them like something physical. He felt it land. He felt the familiar reflex, the closing down the retreat to safe ground, the careful management of whatever was rising in his chest. He felt all of that, and he felt something else too, the exhaustion of it. 15 years of that reflex. 15 years of the retreat. Physical contact, he said. His voice was low. It reminds me of what I had and what... He stopped. He pushed through the stop. The last time someone touched me with care was Sarah. The last time. And it... He pressed his hand flat against his knee. It's like the body remembers things the mind has decided to put away. I can tell myself it's fine. And then someone's hand is there and it isn't fine. It's... He looked up. I haven't touched anyone. Not in 15 years. Not more than what work requires. Clara said nothing for a long moment. I haven't touched anyone in 15 years, he said again, and hearing it aloud for the first time was like hearing the walls of something fall. Clara leaned forward in her chair. She didn't reach for him. She didn't close the distance between them. She just leaned forward and said in a voice that was barely above the fire's sound, Then let me be the first thing that doesn't hurt you. The room was very still. Eli looked at her. He looked at this woman who had arrived on his porch 11 days ago by mistake and stayed by choice, who had fixed his barn door and reorganized his cold cellar and sat with him in silence and in the kind of conversation he had not had with another human being in 15 years. Who had faced Jonah Pike without trembling and told Hal Brennan the truth and never once asked for more than she'd been offered. He looked at her and felt something inside his chest unlock. Not loudly, not with any drama, just the way a door sounds when the latch finally gives. Clara, he said. You don't have to do anything, she said quickly. I'm not asking for anything. I want you to know that you're safe, here, with me. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not quite steady where they held the mug, and he noticed that. He noticed it because he had been paying more attention to her than he realized. I'm not going to hurt you. I know, he said. Then why are you looking at me like that? Like what? Like you're trying to memorize something. He looked down at his hands. He turned them over in his lap. They were a rancher's hands, scarred and rough and permanently stained with work. He looked at them like he was seeing them for the first time. Because I'm afraid, he said. That's why. She didn't say, you don't have to be afraid. She didn't say there's nothing to be afraid of. She was too honest for either of those things. What she said was, I know, me too. That was when he reached across the space between their chairs and put his hand over hers. Not her arm this time, not a reflex, not an accident. A choice. Deliberate and slow, giving her time to see it coming and decide, and she didn't pull away. Her hand was cold from the mug and smaller than his, and she turned it palm up under his without being asked, and they sat like that in front of the dying fire while the Wyoming wind pushed against the walls outside, and neither of them spoke. He was shaking slightly. He was aware of it and could not stop it. Not from cold. She felt it. He knew she felt it because her hand pressed against his, not squeezing, not demanding, just present. A counterweight. An answer. I've got you, she said. So quiet, he almost didn't catch it. He closed his eyes. He had not been held in any sense of the word, not literally, not figuratively, not in the way of one person, simply anchoring another for 15 years. He had forgotten what it felt like to have someone say, I've got you, and mean it about something that had nothing to do with cattle, or legal documents, or property lines. He sat with it. He let it be real. And slowly, the shaking stopped. He didn't know how long they stayed that way. long enough for the fire to go low and the room to cool, and the wind outside to shift from gusting to steady. When he finally opened his eyes, she was watching him with a look that was both asking and answering itself. "I should," he started. "Stay," she said. Then catching herself, "I mean, you don't have to go yet. The fire's still—" She stopped. She looked at him directly. "Stay a little longer." He stayed. They talked, not about Pike or the legal filing or the ranch. About smaller things, her father's horses, one of whom had been a roan gelding, named after a president, she refused to name out of respect for history. About a winter she'd spent in Cheyenne, where the snow came up to the second-floor windows, and the city just kept moving like it hadn't noticed. About the first time he'd bought cattle on his own. He was 21, fresh off the worst grief of his life, spending money he barely had on 8 head of Herefords that turned out to be worth 3 times what he paid, because the seller didn't know what he had. She laughed at that. A real laugh, full and unguarded, and the sound filled the sitting room the way the sound had not filled it in 15 years. He watched her laugh and felt something that he had locked away so long ago he'd forgotten where the key was. Something warm and certain and dangerous, in all the best ways, begin to move through him like water through a crack in winter ice. He recognized it. He didn't name it. Not yet. He wasn't ready to name it, but he recognized it. Chekebe. He was in the barn the next morning earlier than usual, working with a focus that had less to do with the task and more to do with needing his hands occupied while his mind did what it was going to do regardless. Decker came in around 6 and looked at him and said, "You look different." "I look the same." "You don't look the same." Decker hung up his coat and picked up a brush. "Something happened." "No." "Eli." "Nothing happened, Decker." He kept working. "She and I talked last night, that's all." "Talked?" "Talked." Decker ran the brush along the horse's flank in slow, even strokes. "You know," he said conversationally, "I worked for a man once up in Montana, lived alone for 12 years after his wife passed. Everybody in the county thought he was just naturally solitary. Turns out he was terrified, not of people, just of—" he paused, "of wanting something again." Eli said nothing. "Took a stubborn woman about 3 weeks to crack him open," Decker said. "He married her in the spring, had 4 kids, died the happiest man I ever knew." "Are you making a point?" "Me." Decker looked at him with perfect innocence. "I'm just brushing the horse." Eli looked at him. Decker looked at the horse. The horse looked at the wall. "She's an employee," Eli said. "She's the woman who put her hand in yours last night," Decker said, still looking at the horse. Tommy saw through the window. "I told him to keep his mouth shut." Eli opened his mouth, closed it. The back of his neck went warm. "You should tell her," Decker said. "Whatever you're feeling. You should tell her before you talk yourself back into that box you've been living in." He paused. "Sarah would not have wanted the box, Eli. I knew her 3 years, too. She would have hated the box." Eli set down his tools. He stood there with his hands at his sides and the cold barn around him and Decker's words sitting in the air. "Don't bring Sarah into this," he said, but his voice had no edge. "She's already in it," Decker said gently. "She's been in it for 15 years. Maybe it's time to let her have a different kind of place in it." He found Clara at this kitchen table. An hour later, the ledger opened her coffee, going cold the way it always did when she got into the numbers. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and thought about Decker's words. He thought about the sitting room and the fire, and her hand turning palm up under his without being asked. She looked up. She read something in his face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He came in and sat down. Not across from her at the corner of the table, which put him close enough that he could speak quietly. "I need to tell you something." She closed the ledger. She gave him her full attention, the way she always did. "Last night mattered," he said. "To me. I want you to know that." He held her gaze. I don't know how to do this. I haven't done it in a very long time, and I'm likely going to be bad at it, but I want to try. He stopped, started again. If you... Yes, she said. He blinked. I haven't finished. I know what you're asking. Her voice was quiet and very clear. And yes, he looked at her. She looked back. The kitchen was warm and the ledger was closed, and outside the Wyoming wind was doing what it always did, which was blow without asking anyone's permission. I'm still an employee, she said. That doesn't have to change right away. We can be careful. We can go slowly. I don't know another way to go, he said. She smiled. Not the almost smile he'd been collecting in small increments over 11 days. A real one. Full and unguarded and directed entirely at him. He felt it like a hand pressed flat against his chest. Then we'll go slowly, she said. We have time. He looked at her and believed her, and that for a man who had stopped believing in time as anything other than an enemy was the most radical thing that had happened to him in 15 years. They were careful. They had agreed to be careful, and they were, and it was both easier and harder than Eli had expected. Easier because Clara was not a woman who pushed. She had said they would go slowly, and she meant it, and there was no performance of patience in the way she kept to it. No long, meaningful looks designed to remind him of what had been said in the sitting room. No careful engineering of moments. She simply continued, being who she was, which was the most disarming thing she could have done. Because Eli had spent 15 years managing people who wanted something from him, and he had no defense against someone who seemed to want nothing beyond what was already there. Harder because he was aware of her now in a way that could not be undone. He had always been aware of her. She was not a woman who moved through a space without affecting it, but now the awareness had a direction to it. He noticed when she was cold before she said so, because she held her coffee cup with both hands and her shoulders came up slightly. He noticed when the ledger numbers frustrated her because she went very still in a particular way that looked like calm, but wasn't. He noticed the sound of her laugh across a room and the specific way it was different from her polite laugh versus the real one, and he had cataloged this difference without meaning to, and could not uncatalog it now. Decker noticed all of this noticing and said nothing, which was the most generous thing he could have done. Tommy Briggs noticed and said everything, which was less generous, but more honest, and Eli responded by giving him an extra hour of fence repair on the coldest morning of the week. And after that, Tommy confined his observations to the bunkhouse. The ranch itself seemed to notice. This was a foolish thought, and Eli knew it was foolish, but the place had a different quality to it. In those first days, after the sitting room, less like a machine running itself, and more like a place where people lived. Clara had put something on the kitchen windowsill. A small clay pot with dried wildflowers she'd found pressed in the back of one of the ledger books. It was a minor thing. It cost nothing, and changed nothing practical. But every morning when he sat down at that table, his eyes went to it before anything else, and something in his chest said, "Someone is here." He had not understood until now how much he had missed that. Deputy Brennan rode out on a Tuesday morning 12 days after their visit to Ridgeline, and the look on his face when Eli came out to meet him was the careful look of a man carrying news he hadn't fully sorted out yet. "Pike," Brennan said without preamble. "What did he do?" "Filed a counterclaim." Brennan dismounted and tied his horse to the post. "Territorial court 2 days ago. He's claiming the employment contract you filed for Miss Whitfield is a fabrication designed to obstruct a legitimate matrimonial placement, and that the original contract his represents a valid prior claim on her labor and residence." Eli looked at him. "That is the most twisted piece of legal nonsense I have ever heard." "It is," Brennan agreed. "My opinion, for what it's worth, is that no territorial judge with a functioning brain will give it a second reading. But opinions don't stop the paperwork, and the paperwork means we have a hearing date." He pulled a folded document from his coat. 4 weeks out. Red Rock County Courthouse. Eli took the paper. He read it. He handed it back. What does he actually want? Same thing he always wants. He wants you to pay him to go away. Brennan looked at him steadily. The legal claim is pressure, not strategy. He knows it won't hold. He's banking on you deciding the cost of fighting it is higher than the cost of settling. He's wrong. I know he's wrong. But Eli. Brennan paused. There's something else. He looked toward the house. Is Miss Whitfield inside? Yes. I need to speak to her, separately if that's all right. Something tightened in Eli's chest. Why separately? Because what I have to tell her is her business first, and yours second. He held Eli's gaze. I'm not working against you. I want you to know that. But she deserves to hear this without you in the room, so she can decide how she feels about it before she has to manage your reaction to it. Eli stood there for a moment. He did not like this. He liked almost nothing about this conversation. But he recognized the fairness of what Brennan was saying, and he nodded once, and went to the barn, and stayed there for 35 minutes, that felt considerably longer. Clara came to the barn when Brennan was done. He heard her footsteps on the frozen ground. He had learned the specific weight of her step, and he kept working until she appeared in the doorway, and then he looked at her face and stopped working. She looked composed. She always looked composed, but her eyes were doing something that composure couldn't quite reach. Sit down, he said, and pulled a hay bale close. She sat. He sat across from her on an upturned crate. He waited. Jonah Pike didn't choose me at random, she said. Her voice was very even. Brennan has been doing more investigation than he told us about. Pike has a record, not a legal one, not yet, but a pattern. He looks for women in specific circumstances. No family, no money. Desperate enough to accept a contract without demanding verification. She folded her hands in her lap. He finds them through certain boarding houses in Cheyenne. The women who run those houses, he pays them to identify candidates. Eli said nothing. He waited. The woman who ran the house where I was staying, Clara said. Mrs. Aldrich. She recommended me to Pike. She stopped. She breathed. I thought she was kind. She was the first person who had been kind to me after my father died. She helped me find work. She let me stay when I was short on rent. Another stop. She was paid $4 to put my name on a list. The barn was very quiet. Clara, Eli said. I'm fine, she said. You don't have to be fine right now. I know. She looked at her hands. I keep going back over it. Every conversation I had with her, trying to find the moment where I should have known, where the signs were. Stop, he said. She looked up. She deceived you, he said. That's on her, not on you. He held her gaze. You keep trying to find the place where you were stupid and you weren't stupid. You were alone and grieving and someone you trusted betrayed that trust for $4. That is not your failure. That is her crime. Clara stared at him. Her throat moved. You sound very certain about that, she said. I am certain about that. How? He looked at the wall for a moment. Because I spent 20 years being certain that Sarah dying was something I could have prevented. That if I had noticed sooner, acted faster, found a better doctor, if I had done something different, she would have lived. He looked back at her. It wasn't true. I just needed someone to blame, and the nearest person was myself. He paused. You're doing the same thing, and it doesn't lead anywhere good. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he watched her take that in, not deflect it or argue with it. Just take it in the way she took things in, fully and seriously. You're getting better at this, she said quietly. At what? Saying the thing that actually matters instead of the safe thing. He looked away. Don't make a production of it. She almost smiled. He heard it in her voice even though he wasn't looking. I won't, she said. And then, there's one more thing Brennan told me. He looked back. Pike has been talking to someone in Ridgeline. A man named Greer. He owns land adjacent to yours on the east side. Brennan thinks Greer may have been the one who pointed Pike to your ranch in the first place. Greer has apparently been interested in acquiring your east pasture for 2 years. Eli went very still. He thinks Greer and Pike are working together, Clara said. The matrimonial scheme was the mechanism, but the real goal was always the property. Create legal confusion around your ranch manufacture, enough documentation disputes that you'd be tied up in hearings long enough to... She stopped. Long enough to make you want to sell, to Greer, at whatever price he offered. The cold in the barn felt different now. Not weather cold, the other kind. Greer, Eli said. You know him. I've dealt with him twice. He made an offer on the east pasture 18 months ago, below value. I turned him down. Eli stood up. He moved because he needed to move. I turned him down, and 3 months later my fencing on the east side started having problems. Cuts, not breaks. I couldn't prove anything. Brennan thinks he can prove it now, Clara said. The connection between Greer and Pike there are financial records, payments. He's been building the case. How long has he known? He started suspecting when the counterclaim was filed. Greer's name was on one of the supporting documents as a quote-unquote witness to the property's disputed status. She looked at him steadily. Eli, this is bigger than Pike trying to collect a placement fee. This was a coordinated effort to take your ranch. He stood in the middle of the barn, with that fact settling over him like snow, quiet, thorough, covering everything. Someone had looked at everything he had and decided to take it. Someone had used a grieving woman with $17 as a tool to do it. Brennan needs statements, Clara said, from both of us, about every interaction with Pike, every document, every conversation. He wants to build a case strong enough that the territorial court doesn't just dismiss the counterclaim, it opens a full investigation into Greer. When he wants to come back Thursday. Tell him to come Thursday. Eli turned toward the barn door. And Clara. He stopped. He turned back. I'm glad you told me. I wasn't sure you'd want to know all of it. I always want to know all of it. He held her gaze. Don't protect me from information. I can handle information. A pause quieter. It's the other things I'm still working on. She understood what he meant. He saw it in her face, the slight softening around her eyes, the way her shoulders came down a fraction. I know, she said. You're doing well. Don't tell Decker that. He'll get insufferable. This time she did smile. The real one. And he carried it back to the house with him like something he could put in his pocket. The following days moved with the particular tension of people waiting for a danger they can't see to show itself. Eli kept the rifle by the door and slept in lighter increments and checked the east fence line every morning, and he did all of this without telling Clara, and Clara, who noticed everything noticed. She confronted him about it on a Wednesday evening with the directness that he had stopped being surprised by and started being grateful for. You're watching the east pasture, she said. I check all the fence lines. You check the east one 3 times a day. You checked it this morning before breakfast. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, with her hands flat and her eyes level. Tell me what you're worried about. He looked at her. He thought about managing the information. He thought about what he had said in the barn, don't protect me from information, and how that cut both ways. Greer's land borders mine on the east, he said. If he's as invested in this as Brennan thinks, he's not going to wait quietly for the court to rule against him. Men like Greer don't wait quietly. What do you think he'll do? I don't know. That's what worries me. She absorbed this. What can I do? Nothing. Stay close to the house when... Eli, her voice was firm. I mean, what can I do that's useful, not what can I do that makes you feel better about my safety? Those are 2 different questions. He looked at her. He thought about sending her back to Ridgeline where it was safer. He thought about how she would respond to that suggestion, which would not be with gratitude. He thought about the barn conversation and the sitting room, and 11 years of a house that had been full of nothing but silence. The ledgers, he said. There may be a record of the fence damage dates, repair costs. If Brennan can connect the timeline to Greer's activities, it strengthens the case. I haven't gone back through the older records. I'll go through them tonight, she said immediately. Clara. Tonight, she said. Give me the older ledgers. I'll start from 18 months ago and work forward. He got her the ledgers. She stayed up past midnight. He knew, because he stayed up too on the other side of the wall, listening to the scratch of her pen in the quiet house, and telling himself he was just keeping watch. At 1 in the morning, she knocked on the study door. He opened it. She was holding a ledger, and her eyes were bright with the particular energy of someone who has found something. March last year, she said, coming in without waiting to be invited. She spread the ledger on his desk and pointed. You recorded fence repair on the East Line 5 times in 4 months. Each entry says the same thing: wire cut, not broken. You noted it 3 times and then stopped noting it because it kept happening. She looked up. But look at the dates. He looked. March 4th, March 19th, April 2nd, April 17th, May 3rd. Every other week, he said. Exactly every other week, which means it was deliberate and scheduled, not opportunistic. She turned the page. And here July. Nothing. No fence repairs for 6 weeks. She looked at him. What happened in July? He thought. Greer went to Denver. 3 weeks. I remember because there was talk in town. He looked at the ledger. He came back in August and the fence problem started again. That's evidence, Clara said. That's a documented pattern that maps directly to Greer's presence and absence. Brennan can use this. She was leaning over the desk with the ledger, her hair slightly loose from the day, and she was 2 feet from him and entirely focused and completely unaware, apparently, of the fact that he had stopped looking at the ledger. He was aware of it. He looked back at the ledger. You should get some sleep, he said. This is good work. We'll show Brennan Thursday. I want to go through the rest of the records first. She pulled another ledger toward her. Clara. Just the summer months. 20 minutes. He looked at her, bent over the ledger. This woman who had come to his ranch by mistake, and organized his cold cellar, and fixed his barn door, and found the evidence that might save his land. And he thought about $17 and a $4 betrayal, and a stage that had come through at noon, and changed everything. 20 minutes, he said, and pulled up the other chair. They sat together at the desk for 45 minutes, which was not 20, and they found 2 more confirming patterns in the records, and when they were done, she looked up and found him closer than she'd realized, and neither of them moved for a moment. Good night, Eli, she said, softly. Good night, he said. She took her ledger and went back down the hall, and he sat at the desk for a long time after looking at nothing. Thursday came with Brennan and 2 hours of careful statement-giving that was more draining than physical labor, and when it was done, and Brennan had everything he needed, he sat back and looked at them both with the expression of a man who has just been handed a better hand than he expected. The ledger evidence is significant, he said. Combined with the financial records I already have connecting Greer to Pike's bureau and Miss Whitfield's testimony about the original arrangement. This is a case, Mercer, a real one, not just dismissal of the counterclaim. A case. How long? Eli asked. Filing with the territorial court takes 2 weeks. The hearing date is already set. My guess is the judge sees the Greer connection and orders a full investigation before the original hearing is even concluded. Brennan looked at Clara. You'll need to testify. I know, she said. I will. You're not afraid of Pike. I'm afraid of him, she said. I'm doing it anyway. Brennan nodded once with the respect of a man who has seen a lot of people afraid and not a lot of them push through it cleanly. I'll be in touch before the hearing date. He stood. He looked at Eli. Get that lawyer. I have a lawyer, Eli said. Cheyenne, rode out yesterday. Brennan raised his eyebrows. You moved fast. Someone told me it was important. He glanced at Clara. She looked at the table, but her mouth was doing something. After Brennan left, the house settled back into its own kind of quiet. Decker and the hands gave them space. They seemed to have developed an instinct for when space was needed, and Eli and Clara sat at the kitchen table, with the remaining coffee going cold between them. It's going to be all right, she said. Not as comfort, as assessment. She said it the way she said all things because she had looked at the information and reached a conclusion she was willing to stand behind. Yes, he said. You believe that? He looked at her. I'm starting to. She held his gaze for a moment, and then something shifted in her face. Not the smile. Something earlier than the smile, the thing the smile came from. "Can I tell you something?" "Yes. When I got on that stage in Cheyenne," she said, "I was the most frightened I had ever been in my life. I had almost nothing left, and I was going to a place I'd never been to meet a person I'd never seen, and the only reason I got on the stage instead of getting off it was that I had run completely out of other options." She looked down at the table. "I used to think that was one of the worst moments of my life. Getting on because I had no choice." She looked up. "I don't think that anymore." He was quiet. "I think it was—" She stopped. She tried again. "I think sometimes the things that look like they're happening to you are actually happening for you, and you can't tell the difference until enough time has passed." She looked at him directly. "I'm glad the stage came here. I'm glad your name was on that fraudulent contract. I'm glad I didn't have anywhere else to go." The kitchen was very quiet. "Clara," he said, "you don't have to say anything." "I want to." He put his hand on the table, not reaching for her, just placing it there, open the way an offer is placed. "I'm glad you stayed," he said, "not because of the ledgers or the legal case, or because the ranch needed a bookkeeper." He held her gaze. "I'm glad you stayed because this house was dead before you came, and I had gotten used to it being dead, and I had decided that was acceptable." He paused. "It wasn't acceptable. I just didn't have anyone to show me that until you." She looked at his hand on the table. She put hers over it. "You showed yourself," she said. "I just stayed in the room." He looked at their hands. He thought about the sitting room and the fire and the shaking he couldn't control, and the way she had said, "I've got you," in a voice barely above a whisper. He thought about 15 years of cold mornings and 3 rooms out of 17, and Pearl being the only living thing that touched him without it meaning something needed doing. He turned his hand over under hers and held on. She held on back. They stayed like that while the coffee went cold, and the afternoon light shifted through the kitchen, and the wind outside did what the wind always did. And neither of them spoke, because the things that needed saying had been said, and the things that hadn't been said yet were not ready, and that was all right. That was more than all right. 2 days before the hearing, Greer made his move. Eli was in the north pasture when he heard the shot, not close, but close enough, coming from the direction of the east fence line. He was on his horse and moving before the sound finished echoing, and he came over the rise to find Tommy Briggs on the ground, with his hand pressed to his shoulder, and 2 men on horseback disappearing fast toward Greer's property line. Tommy was alive. The shot had gone through the meat of his shoulder. Painful, serious, not fatal. Eli got him back to the ranch and sent Decker riding hard for Ridgeline, and he sat with Tommy in the bunkhouse, while Clara bandaged the wound with a steadiness that should not have surprised him, but did. "You've done this before," he said, watching her work. "My father's ranch," she said, not looking up. "You learn." She tied off the bandage and looked at Tommy's pale face. "You're going to be all right. Can you tell Mr. Mercer exactly what you saw?" Tommy told them. 2 men. One he recognized, a ranch hand who had worked for Greer the previous summer. The shot had come after they told him to deliver a message to Mercer, drop the legal case, sell the east pasture, and the trouble would stop. When Tommy finished, Clara stood up. She turned to Eli. Her face was composed, and her eyes were burning. "This is not going to stop him," she said. "Greer, he's not going to stop." "I know." "Then we can't wait for the hearing." She looked at him. "Brennan needs to know about this tonight, not tomorrow tonight. This isn't a land dispute anymore." "I know," he said again. "I'm going with you to Ridgeline." "Clara, I am going with you," she said in the voice that meant the decision had been made. "He used me as the mechanism for this entire scheme. I am going to be there when it falls apart." She held his gaze. "Don't try to protect me from this. This is mine too." He looked at her for a long moment, at the bandage on Tommy's shoulder, at the darkness coming down outside, and the 8 miles to Ridgeline, and the 2 men who had disappeared toward Greer's fence line. "Get your coat," he said. She got her coat. Brennan arrested Greer's man before midnight, the one Tommy had identified, found at a saloon in Ridgeline, with the smell of gunpowder still on his hands, and the particular bad luck of a man who had underestimated how fast news traveled in a small county. He was talking by 2 in the morning, the way men who are not loyal but merely employed talk when the consequences become concrete. He gave them Greer, he gave them Pike, he gave them dates and amounts and instructions, and Brennan took all of it down in his careful deputy's hand and sent a rider to the county sheriff before dawn. Eli and Clara sat in Brennan's outer office while all of this happened on a bench against the wall waiting. At some point, he couldn't have said when she had leaned against his shoulder. At some point after that, he had put his arm around her. Neither of them had remarked on this. It had simply happened the way things between them tended to happen quietly without announcement, as though it had always been inevitable and was simply arriving now. She fell asleep against his shoulder somewhere around 3 in the morning. He didn't move. He sat in the deputy's outer office with his arm around a woman who had arrived on his porch by mistake 23 days ago, and he looked at the ceiling and thought about what it meant to have someone lean on you and not feel the weight of it as threat. It felt like being trusted. He had forgotten how good that felt. He held very still, and she slept. And outside in the cold Wyoming dark, Jonah Pike's scheme was coming apart at every seam, and Eli Mercer, who had stopped living 15 years ago, and had only recently begun to understand that, sat in the warm and the quiet, and felt for the first time in a very long time like a man who had something worth protecting. Not just the land and everything on it. Everything that had grown there despite all his attempts to keep the ground fallow. He looked down at her and didn't look away. She woke with her cheek against his shoulder and the particular disorientation of a person who has fallen asleep somewhere unexpected and needs a moment to reconstruct the world. He felt her come awake, the slight shift in her breathing, the small tension that moved through her as she remembered where she was and how she had gotten there. He waited to see what she would do with it. Whether she would pull back and apologize and make it smaller than it was, the way people sometimes made necessary things smaller to protect themselves from having needed them. She didn't pull back. She lifted her head and looked at him, and her eyes were clear in the way eyes are when someone has actually slept instead of just endured the dark. And she said, "Did you sleep at all?" "Some," he said. She looked at him with the expression that meant she didn't believe that, but wasn't going to argue. "What time is it?" "Past 4. She straightened up slowly. She didn't move away from him entirely. She sat beside him on the bench, the way she had been sitting close enough that their arms still touched, and she looked at the door to Brennan's inner office. "Is it done?" "Brennan sent for the county sheriff around 2. I don't know everything that happened after that." He paused. "Greer's man gave them names, more than just Pike. There are apparently 2 other ranches in the territory where Pike ran the same scheme. Different women, different contracts. Some of them paid him off. One signed over water rights." His jaw was tight. "Brennan thinks the territorial court will want to make an example." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. Not with satisfaction, with the flat certainty of someone who has considered the matter and reached a fair conclusion. The door opened, and Brennan came through it, looking like a man who had not slept and was running on purpose, and cold coffee. He looked at them both on the bench, and something moved across his face. Not surprise, something quieter than that. "It's done," he said. "Greer's man gave a full statement. Named Greer, named Pike, named the arrangement going back 14 months. He sat down on the edge of the desk across from them. "I've sent riders to bring Greer in. Pike is another matter. He moves fast, and he knew we were building a case. But there's a warrant now. Territorial, not county. He won't be able to work this territory again." "Will he be found?" Clara asked. "Probably. Men like Pike depend on the same channels, same boarding houses, same brokers, same networks. Once those networks know there's a warrant, they close up. He becomes a liability instead of a revenue source." Brennan looked at her directly. "You won't be hearing from him again. I want you to know that." Clara nodded once. She pressed her lips together and looked at her hands. He had come to know that gesture. It was the one she made when she was processing something significant without wanting to make a production of it. Eli put his hand over hers. He did it without thinking about it, which was new. 3 weeks ago, the motion would have required the kind of deliberate courage that leaves you breathless. Now, it was just what you did. What his hand did when hers was there. She turned her hand over under his and held on same as always. Brennan watched this and said nothing. He was a good enough man to know when to look at his notes. Kyo. They rode back to the ranch in the early gray of morning, the horses moving steady on the frozen road, and the sky doing what the Wyoming sky did in the hour before real light, going from black to a deep particular blue that looked like the color of something that had decided to be honest. They didn't talk much. They had gotten good at the kind of silence that didn't need filling, and this one had a different quality than the silences before lighter, the way air feels after a storm has moved through and taken the pressure with it. Halfway home, she said, "I've been thinking." About what? About what comes next. She kept her eyes on the road. The legal case will take months to fully resolve, even if Brennan has everything he needs. The hearing is still in 2 weeks. Your lawyer will need me available to testify. Yes. So I can't leave before then? No. And after the hearing, the investigation into Greer's other activities will probably require additional testimony. Months, you said. Probably. She was quiet for a moment. I want to stay, she said. Not because of the legal case. The legal case is a reason to stay that I can explain to anyone who asks, but it's not the real reason. She looked at him. I want you to know that. The legal case is convenient. It's not why. He looked at her. The blue light was doing something to the planes of her face that he was aware he was cataloging for later, which was the kind of thought a man had when he had stopped trying not to have those thoughts. Why? He said. Because this is the first place I've been in 2 years that felt like somewhere I belonged, she said. Because Pearl lets me brush her, and she doesn't let anyone do that. Because Decker told me last week that the books hadn't looked this good since before you lost Sarah, and he said it like it mattered, like I had done something real. She looked back at the road. Because you held my hand in a deputy's waiting room at 3 in the morning and didn't let go, and I can't remember the last time someone did that, and I don't want to go somewhere that doesn't have that in it. The horses moved through the early dark. The sky kept going toward blue. Stay, he said. She looked at him. Not for the hearing, not for the testimony. He held her gaze. Stay because I asked you to. Because I'm asking you to. She looked at him for a long moment with those clear, steady eyes that had been looking at him honestly since the first day on the porch, and she said, All right, Eli, I'll stay. The hearing was on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Greer's man had talked, and the writers had gone out, and the machinery of territorial law had begun its slow, grinding work. They rode to the Red Rock County Courthouse in the wagon, with Eli's lawyer, a spare, precise man from Cheyenne named Aldous Crick, who wore the same expression whether discussing cattle prices or criminal fraud, which Eli found enormously reassuring. The courtroom was a plain room with wooden benches, and a judge who had the face of a man who had seen every variety of human foolishness, and was no longer surprised by any of it. His name was Thurston Reeves, and Brennan had told them in advance that Reeves had a particular intolerance for the kind of paper manufacturing schemes that Pike specialized in. Brennan had said this with the closest thing to optimism Eli had ever heard in his voice. Pike was not in the courtroom. He had not been found. The warrant was active and Brennan remained confident, but for today, the case would proceed on the documents and the testimony, and Pike's absence from the proceedings was itself a kind of evidence. Greer was there. He sat at the table across the aisle from Eli and Crick with a lawyer of his own, and the expression of a man who had decided that dignity was the only card he had left. He looked at Eli once when they came in. Eli looked back without expression. Greer looked away first. Clara sat in the gallery behind Eli. He could feel her there the way you feel a fire at your back. Not heat exactly, just the awareness of warmth and presence, and something steady at your six. Crick was good. Better than good. He walked Judge Reeves through the timeline with the methodical patience of a man who had spent 30 years convincing skeptical audiences that the documented facts were exactly as interesting as he was about to prove they were. The forged signature. The ledger records and their pattern. The financial connection between Pike and Greer. The testimony from Greer's own man. The other properties, the other women, the other contracts. When Clara was called to testify, she walked to the front of the room without hesitation, and she answered every question Crick asked in the same clear, direct voice she used for everything. No performance, no drama. Just the facts laid out in order by someone who had organized 2 years of someone else's bookkeeping and knew exactly how to make a sequence of events legible. Greer's lawyer tried to suggest that her presence at the ranch had been voluntary, in a way that implied arrangement rather than fraud. Clara looked at him with an expression that Eli had seen once before, the one she wore when she had already considered an argument and found it insufficient. "I got on a stage with $17 because a woman I trusted told me a contract had been verified," she said. "I arrived at a ranch belonging to a man I had never met, who had never heard of me, and who immediately told me the contract was fraudulent. I went with him to the deputy's office the following day to file a statement saying so." She paused. "If that sequence of events suggests voluntary arrangement to you, I'd be curious to hear your definition of the word." There was a sound in the gallery that was not quite laughter but was close. Judge Reeves did not smile, but something around his eyes changed. The ruling came at the end of the afternoon session. Reeves dismissed Pike's counterclaim with language that Crick later described with professional restraint as unusually pointed. He ordered the original fraudulent contract voided and expunged from county records. He referred the case against Greer to a territorial investigator with a recommendation for criminal charges on 3 counts, including conspiracy to defraud and the ordering of violence, the shot that had taken Tommy Briggs in the shoulder. He looked at Eli over the top of his papers and said, "Your ranch is your ranch. Mr. Mercer, it always was. This court apologizes for the burden of having to prove it." Eli said, "Thank you, Your Honor." His voice was very even. He was not even on the inside. On the inside, something was moving that had no name. Yet not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. Something more like the feeling of a thing finally fitting the way it was always supposed to fit. Like a door that had been slightly off its frame for 15 years, finally hanging true. He turned around. Clara was standing in the gallery, and she was looking at him the way she had looked at him that first morning when he sat down at the kitchen table, and she put coffee in front of him, like she was very glad he was there. He walked toward her. He didn't plan what he was going to do. His hands came up and took her face gently, the way you hold something you have just understood is precious. And he looked at her for one moment, and she looked back with her eyes very bright. And then he kissed her, right there in the Red Rock County courtroom, with Aldous Crick looking at the ceiling, and Hal Brennan looking at the floor, and whoever else was in the gallery looking at whatever they needed to look at. It was not a complicated kiss. It was the kind that meant something simple and enormous. "I choose this. I choose you." When he pulled back, she was smiling, the full one, the real one, the one that went all the way up. "You could have done that in private," she said very quietly. "I know," he said. "I didn't want to." She looked at him. "Who are you?" she said. "And what did you do with the man who couldn't look at me for 3 days?" "He's still here," Eli said. "He's just getting better at things." The ride home was different from every ride before it. Not louder, not more. Just different in the way that things are different when the ground has shifted under them, and everyone knows it, and no one has to announce it. Crick rode his own horse back to town. Brennan had given them a nod that contained for Brennan an extraordinary amount of warmth. And Eli and Clara rode back to Red Rock Valley in the wagon with the reins loose in his hands and her sitting closer than necessary on a bench with plenty of room, and neither of them commented on the proximity. "About 3 miles from the ranch," she said. "Tommy is going to want to know everything. Tommy is going to be insufferable about the courthouse. Decker will be worse. Decker already knows. He always already knows." He glanced at her. "He told me about the Montana rancher, the one who was afraid to want things again." She looked at him sideways. "When?" "Day after the sitting room. He was brushing the horse and explaining without explaining that I should stop being a coward. He said that. He said it the way Decker says things, with a horse between us, so I couldn't walk away." She laughed. He felt it go through him the way her laugh always went through him now, warm and real, and entirely his in the sense that it was there in his life, in his house, on his road, and that was something he had done nothing to deserve and everything to keep. "Are you still afraid?" she asked, not testing him, genuinely asking. He thought about it. "Yes," he said. "But it's different now. Before the fear was about loss. Like if I let anything in, it would be taken. And that was certain. The only way to not lose something was to not have it." He kept his eyes on the road. "Now I'm afraid of the ordinary things, saying the wrong thing, moving too fast or not fast enough, not being—" He stopped. "Not being enough." Enough for what? He was quiet for a moment. "For this. For you." She turned to look at him fully. "Eli Mercer," she said in a voice that was very quiet and very certain. "You are the man who kept a forged contract from being used against an innocent woman, who rode to Ridgeline in the dark and sat on a bench all night and didn't let go of my hand once, who told me to stop blaming myself for being deceived and then said the same thing about himself for the first time in 15 years. She paused. "You have been enough since the second day. You have been more than enough since the sitting room. The only person who hasn't known that is you." He had no answer for that. He sat with it in the way he was learning to sit with things that were large and true and slightly terrifying without running, without managing, without filing them away somewhere they couldn't reach him. He sat with it and let it be real. The ranch came into view. The smoke from the bunkhouse chimney. The barn with its door that swung clean on a hinge she had fixed. Pearl moving in the paddock, who would stop and look when she heard the wagon because she had already learned the particular sound it made when Clara was on it. The house. His house. 17 rooms, and he was going to use more of them now. Decker was waiting at the gate. Of course he was. He looked at their faces, and then he looked at the sky with the expression of a man receiving confirmation of information he had possessed for some time. "Well?" he said. "How'd it go?" "Greer faces criminal charges," Eli said. "Pike's counterclaim is voided. The ranch is clear." "And," Decker said. Eli looked at him. "And what?" Decker looked at Clara. Clara looked at the gatepost with tremendous interest. "And everything is fine, Decker," Eli said. "Everything is better than fine," Clara said to the gatepost. Decker smiled a real one, the kind that used his whole face. "Tommy's been awake since noon wanting to know the results. He'll have questions." "Tommy can wait until morning," Eli said. "He's going to be very put out. He'll survive. He survived a bullet." Decker stepped back and let them through, and as the wagon passed, he said quietly to no one in particular, "Sarah would have liked her." Eli heard it. He felt it land not as pain, not the way those words would have landed 3 weeks ago, not as grief, as something closer to peace. The acknowledgement of one true thing alongside another true thing, and both of them allowed to exist at once. He didn't turn around. He drove the wagon to the barn, and climbed down, and helped Clara down, and held her hand one extra moment before letting go, and he went to see to the horses. Pearl nosed against his shoulder the moment he came into the stall. He ran his hand along her neck, and stood with her for a moment in the quiet of the barn. "I know," he said to her. She snorted. "I know, don't make a production." That evening, he built the fire in the sitting room, and she came in without knocking and sat in her chair. Her chair. Not Sarah's chair. The distinction had been made, and it was right, and they sat. The way they had learned to sit together, which was the way of people who have found something worth keeping and are learning how to keep it without holding so tight it can't breathe. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You always ask permission to ask," she said. "You can just ask. Can I ask you something?" She smiled at the fire. "Yes, Eli." "What do you want?" He looked at her. "Not what you need, not what's practical. What do you actually want?" She looked at him for a long time. He waited because he had learned to wait for her the way she had learned to wait for him, without pressure. with patience, with the understanding that the real answers took longer than the easy ones. "I want a dog," she said. "The ranch needs a dog. I don't know why you don't have one." He stared at her. "That's your answer." "I'm not finished." She held up one finger. "I want to rebuild the east fence line properly in the spring because half of it is Greer's patchwork and it shows." Another finger. "I want to teach Pearl a better ground tie because she drifts and it's going to get someone hurt." She looked at him. "And I want you to stop sleeping like you're waiting for something to go wrong. Because nothing is going wrong. And you've been waiting for 15 years and I think you should stop." He looked at her. "That's a very practical list. I told you, I'm practical." "Clara." She lowered her hand. She looked at him directly. "I want what's already here," she said. "I want to stay in this house and work these books and ride out to the pasture in the morning and come back at night to a fire, and a man who is learning slowly, stubbornly, wonderfully to let someone matter to him again." She held his gaze. "That's what I want. Is that enough of an answer?" He stood up from his chair. He crossed to hers and held out his hand, and she took it and stood, and he held both her hands and looked at her in the firelight, and thought about 20 years old and 3 years and a February that had lasted 15 years, and a stagecoach that had come through at noon by mistake and changed everything. "It's the best answer I've ever heard," he said. She stepped close. She put her hand flat on his chest over his heart the way she had wanted to in the stove moment and hadn't the way she had been careful not to because she was always giving him the door. He put his hand over hers and held it there. "Still afraid?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "A little." "Good," she said. "That means it's real." He looked at her. "He thought I have been standing in this house for 15 years, waiting without knowing I was waiting. He thought..." She fixed the barn door. He thought she turned her hand palm up without being asked. He thought Sarah would have liked her. Decker was right. Sarah absolutely would have liked her. He pulled her in. She came without resistance, her hand still on his chest, her face against his shoulder, and he held her the way you hold something that is both fragile and stronger than you, which is the only honest way to hold the things that matter. The fire burned. The clock on the mantel moved. Outside, the Wyoming night was cold and vast and entirely indifferent to the small, warm fact of two people holding on to each other in a sitting room that had been silent for too long. The ranch breathed. The house breathed. He breathed slowly, fully, the way a man breathes when he has stopped being afraid of the air. 3 weeks later, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, which was not a romantic setting, and he knew it. But he had learned that the most important things in his life had happened in ordinary moments in that kitchen, and it seemed right that this one should too. He put a ring on the table. It had been his grandmother's. He had kept it in a box in the bottom of the wardrobe for 15 years because getting rid of it felt wrong and looking at it felt impossible, and now neither of those things was true. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. "Tuesday morning," she said. "Yes." "In the kitchen." "I know it's not. It's perfect," she said. And she meant it. He could tell she meant it because she said things she meant and didn't say things she didn't. She picked up the ring and turned it in the light, and then she looked at him with the full smile, the real one, the one that had been quietly putting him back together for 6 weeks. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He put the ring on her finger. His hands were steady. He had been shaking the first time he held her hand, standing in the sitting room with the fire going low and 15 years of isolation cracking open around him. His hands had trembled. He remembered it. They were steady now. She looked at her hand, and then she looked at him, and she said, "You're not shaking." "No," he said. "Is that because you're not afraid?" He thought about it honestly. "It's because I'm sure," he said. "I'm still a little afraid, but I'm more sure than I am afraid, and that's new." She stepped to him. She put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the kitchen in the morning light. And outside, Pearl was waiting for her morning brush, and Decker was coming across from the bunkhouse, and Tommy Briggs, whose shoulder was healing well, was probably already asking someone when breakfast was ready. The ranch was alive. The house was alive. The man who had stopped living 15 years ago, who had kept himself going through sheer stubborn work, and the refusal to need anything, who had woken at 4 every morning in the dark, and endured the silence, and told himself it was enough, that man was alive too. Differently than before. More carefully. More honestly. With full knowledge of what could be lost, and the choice to love anyway, which is the only kind of love that means anything. He held his wife not on paper, not by fraud, not by mistake, but by every choice they had both made since a stagecoach came through at noon, and she stepped down and said, "I'm your wife." And the world he had sealed up against itself began slowly, impossibly to open. He had thought he was broken forever. He was not broken. He had never been broken. He had only been waiting without knowing it, without naming it for something worth waking up for. And the ranch was no longer silent. It had not been silent for 6 weeks. It breathed and moved and carried the sound of her laugh, and Pearl's snort, and Decker's quiet wisdom, and Tommy's relentless questions, and the scratch of a pen in the ledger books, and 2 people learning how to inhabit the same life without losing themselves in it. It breathed like a living thing. Because it was.